Hi everyone and welcome to the 5th episode. In this one, we'll explore a concept in NextJS called dynamic routes. By the end of this lesson, you will have learned how to statically generate pages with dynamic routes using getStaticPaths, implement the getStaticProps function to fetch the data for each page, and also how to link to a page with a dynamic route. Static site generation allows you to generate a page depending on external data. Dynamic routes extend this concept by allowing you to generate page paths depending on external data. The route we've generated so far looks like this. Dynamic routes allow us to put a parameter inside of the route itself, making the result look like this. The ID part of the route is what's dynamic about it, since it can be anything we want. In our case, we'll want to statically generate a list of movies based on their ID. It's important to clearly define what those IDs are, since in order for NextJS to statically generate those pages, it will need to fetch the data for each one of them. NextJS provides the getStaticPaths function to allow us to define the list of IDs of the pages we want to fetch data for at build time. In our case, we'll define the IDs of the movies we want to show. But first, let's look at a more generic example. Here we can build a list of IDs of the pages we want to generate, and then return them in an object with the paths property containing them. The paths property is required by the getStaticPaths interface. As of right now, the function is not complete. Although we need to return a list of IDs, the paths property must contain an array of objects that have the following structure. They have a params property and inside of it the property of ID. The params property on the object actually refers to what parameters we want to insert into each statically generated page. In our case, the ID property refers to the movie ID. Let's create a new variable holding this information. We're going to map each ID to a new object with the params property. With a small refactor, the full code looks like this. Great, so far we've told NextJS which pages we want to statically generate. Now we have to refactor the getStaticProps function in order to make it more dynamic. The way we do so is by receiving the params object from the getStaticPaths function. In order to do that, insert the parameter context into the function definition and then extract the ID from the params. And that's it. Now we have access to the ID property of the page we want to statically generate. This means that if the getStaticPaths function returns the IDs of 1, 2, 3, 4, we'll have 4 different getStaticProps functions, each one of them with their own ID. Let's apply what we've just learned to our project. I'm going to build upon the code from last episode. If you want to follow along, be sure to clone the episode 4 branch. Let's start by creating a new dynamic route. In order to do so, create a new folder named Movies, and inside of it, move the current movie.tsx file and rename it to id.tsx. As we've just learned, this route is dynamic since the ID can be anything. Now we have a new dynamic route in our project at /movies/id. Next, let's implement the getStaticPaths function. First off, import the getStaticPaths interface. Then, under the component, create the function definition. Instead of manually typing the movie IDs we want to statically generate, let's fetch the most popular movies and extract their IDs. We can do so by calling the /movie/popular endpoint in the movie database API. There is a lot of information that comes with this request, but all we want from it are the movie IDs. We can extract them using a simple map function. Here, I've put them directly in the params property. Lastly, let's return the movie IDs as paths. We also need to add a fallback property telling NextJS to return a 404 page to any routes that don't match the provided movie IDs. Now, let's refactor the getStaticProps function in order to use the movie ID. Insert a new parameter named context and extract the ID from the params. Now we can use this ID in order to fetch that particular movie. Refactor the fetch function in order to get the movie with this ID. Awesome, now the flow is complete. We could build the app right now and run it, but we'd have to guess what those movie IDs are. Instead of that, let's do one more thing. Generate the list of popular movies on the homepage and create a link between each movie and this dynamic route. First off, go to the index.tsx file and write a new getStaticProps function in order to fetch the list of popular movies. The API endpoint for that is /movie/popular. Of course, we'll convert the response to JSON format. Lastly, let's extract the ID of each popular movie and pass it in the component props. As we've done before, let's define the type of the props and deconstruct them. Using NextPageProps is the alternative way of applying the props type if the component is defined as an arrow function. Now that we have the popular movie IDs, let's create a link to each one of them. Instead of the home component, use the map function to create a new link for every movie ID in the props. The link component has an href pointing to /movies/movie ID, which is exactly what we needed. Also, since we're using the map method, be sure to give each element a unique key. In our case, we'll use the movie ID. Let's create a production build and run it. As you can see, you can click on any movie and the page will load instantly. In the next episode, we'll dive into server-side rendering, we'll add external images to our project as well as making everything look better with CSS. See you there.